I think this passage from the book of Hebrews encourages us to look upon the cure of our sin, which is the eternal Word of God himself, racked with pain on the cross, dying, bleeding, and suffocating to death. It invites us to look upon that cure for our sin and ponder to ourselves, if God had to do this to save me, imagine how far gone I was. So a few years ago now, Jasmine and I served as chaplains at Camp Medley. I think most of you know that Camp Medley is a church camp that's run by this diocese. And on the last night of the camp that week, we did a kind of spiritual exercise with the kids. We made them all gather around the campfire in a big circle, and then we had them close their eyes, and we led them into a kind of prayerful state, just a calm, prayerful state. Then we had them do a couple of things. The first thing that we had them do was calmly acknowledge the things that they regret having said or thought or done in the past. So in short, we had them call to mind whatever, failings or shortcomings or regrets that happened to be burdening their conscience. In fact, we had them close their eyes and imagine these things as kind of a patch of darkness sitting before them in their mind's eye. Then what we encourage the kids to do is picture themselves turning away from that darkness, sort of just kind of pivoting away from it, and turning towards the warm and profoundly welcoming light of Christ. And we describe this light as being infinitely good, infinitely welcoming. And as they envisioned this light, this is what we said to them. We said to them, now in this very moment, Jesus is inviting you into the limitless love of the Father. He's taken care of all of that darkness, the darkness that you've just turned your back on. He's dealt with it. And all he wants to do right now in this moment is draw you into the light of his love forever. And then we said, all you have to do is just say yes. And we kind of left it at that. And the next day was morning. We were able to gather together again with the campers in the chapel. And we had them reflect on that spiritual exercise, because by then they had had at least, a few hours to think about it, to process it. A lot of them found it very significant. They found it very moving. But one young man shared the following with me. He said to me, look, last night, when you told me that God simply wanted to love me, when you said that all I had to do was let him in and receive that love, I froze up. I couldn't say yes, because I don't believe myself to be worthy of that kind of love here. So in short, that young man saw his, and I'm going to use the word now, sin. He saw his sin as a ball and chain that was holding him back from God's embrace. Now, the idea that sin can alienate us from the love of God, of course, isn't new. You see, the ancient Jews believed that the God whom they worshipped, the God of heaven and earth, was holy. It's not just that God possessed the quality of holiness. God was holiness itself. The God whom they worshipped was the radiant fullness of all perfection. Human beings, however, were not holy. Rather, human beings are sullied by the pollution of sin. Because you see, according to the Jewish mind, sin is a kind of death force. Sin is a thing that defiles people. It stains people in some way. As a matter of fact, there's even the sense in the Old Testament that sin can stain actual objects, physical things. And needless to say, mortals who are stained with sin cannot enter into the presence of the holy. In fact, they court death when they enter into the presence of the holy. Maybe you remember that old story from the book of Exodus about the presence of God appearing on the summit of Mount Sinai. And God says to Moses, "Go down and warn the people not to break through to look to the Lord, otherwise many of them will perish." So the idea being here that the holy and the unholy don't mix. Now, fortunately, God has provided for the people of Israel a purifying solvent. In other words, something that has the power to cleanse or to wash people from the stain of sin, so that they can enter into relationship with the holy God. And that thing is blood, specifically the blood of certain animals. So it says in the book of Leviticus, "The life of every living thing is in the blood. And that is why the Lord has commanded that all blood be poured out on the altar to take away the people's sin. Blood, which is life, takes away sins." Okay. It gets actually a little bit more complicated than that, actually much more complicated. The blood couldn't just come from any animal, it had to come from specifically clean animals. So doves and goats and bulls, I think those were all considered clean animals. Also, these clean animals could not be slaughtered by just anyone. They had to be slaughtered by designated people. So these were priests who were all descended from Aaron, the first high priest, who I'm sure you all know was the brother of Moses. And these Levitical priests, as they were called, couldn't slaughter animals just anywhere. These rituals had to be performed in the tabernacle, which was this great tent where God's holy presence was believed to have dwelt in a very unique and special way. Of course, the Jews believed that God was everywhere, but his presence was somehow uniquely real in the tabernacle. So again, I don't need to say this. All of this sounds really strange. It sounds alien to us. It sounds bizarre. And there's an obvious reason for that. To put the matter bluntly, this kind of thing isn't done anymore. These rituals certainly aren't performed in churches. Not once have I slaughtered anything on that altar or on that communion table. Why? Well, this approach to dealing with the problem of human sin has been done away with, and it's been replaced by something else. This elaborate system, all of these rituals featuring tabernacle and priest and blood and burnt offerings, belong to what the book of Hebrews refers to as the Old Covenant. And a covenant, by the way, can be seen as a kind of contract, a deal, if you will. Now, however, there's a new covenant, there's a new deal, if you want to put it that way, that's vastly superior to the old one. The author of Hebrews writes, "If that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no need to look for a second one." Now, this point I want to make clear. It's not as if God made a mistake by introducing the first covenant. It's not as if God introduced this first covenant and said, "Oh, this animal sacrifice thing is not going to work. What was I thinking?" Rather, the old covenant was always provisional. It was always temporary. It was never really God's long-term means of tackling the problem of human sin. At best, it was an elaborate system that pointed towards, or it bore witness to, the eventual arrival of an ultimate way of dealing with sin. And it's this new and final way of dealing with sin that's really the subject of much of the book of Hebrews, and it's going to be the subject of much of my talk this morning. So according to the new covenant, there's now just one priest. There's one high priest who holds this office forever. He holds this position eternally, and that high priest is Christ. Under the old covenant, there was a series of high priests. First there was Aaron, then there was the son of Aaron, and then the grandson of Aaron, and so on, all throughout the generations. This is what the author of Hebrews writes, just in today's reading that we heard earlier. "The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he, that is Christ, holds this priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Jesus, as the risen Lord, will never die again. Therefore, he serves as the high priest forever. And all human beings throughout all time can come to God through Christ as a kind of mediator, if you will, as a kind of bridge, leading them into ultimately communion with God the Father." Okay. There's another critical difference between the many priests of the Old Covenant and Christ, the high priest, the eternal high priest. The priests of the Old Covenant were all flawed men. They were all sinful. They all made mistakes. And when they made offerings in the tabernacle, they did so first to cleanse themselves of their sins, and then to cleanse the sins of the people. And they had to do this at least once a year on the Day of Atonement, which is a special day on the Jewish calendar. I think it's still celebrated to this day. Not so with Christ, though, the high priest of the new covenant. This is what the author of Hebrew writes. For it was fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, blameless, undefiled, separated from sinners. So unlike the priests of old, Jesus is perfect. So he's without sin. Furthermore, according to the author of Hebrews, he has no need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for those of the people. This he did once for all when he offered himself. So that's a crucial difference right there. Unlike the priests of old, Jesus offers himself as a sacrifice. Specifically, he offers himself on the cross. So not only is he the priest, but he's the actual sacrifice as well. He's, to quote St. John of Patmos, the lamb that was slain. And in that one sacrifice, he dealt with all of human sin, your sin and my sin, the sin of past generations and the sin of generations yet to come, on the cross, once and for all. And that once and for all notion of dealing with sin is really heavily emphasized in the Book of Common Prayer, Eucharistic prayer, the one that you probably are used to from back when you were a kid, which states that Jesus made there by his one oblation of himself once offered a full, perfect, sufficient oblation and satisfaction for the sins of the whole world. I'm sure those words are just burned into your head. So to restate an idea that I presented earlier, God is holy. God is pure goodness. He's not merely loving. He is love itself. He is fierce, pure, radiant love. We, on the other hand, are tainted by sin. So how can human beings, tainted as we are by, our jealousy and resentment and hatred and lust and greed and all that sort of thing, how could we enter into the presence of the holy? Well, the only way that can happen is by being cleansed. The old covenant, with its elaborate system of priests and temple and bloodshed and sacrifice, offered a kind of temporary, you could say superficial, ritual cleansing, but it was never enough to deal with the problem of human sin. For this, a new covenant was necessary. And Jesus is the guarantor of that new covenant. It is he who cleanses us totally from the taint of sin, and he allows us to have communion with the God of infinite love. He allows us to have communion with the holy God. Now, there are two kinds of people that are going to receive this message. Two kinds of people who are going to hear this message. The first kind of people will, if they truly receive it at least, find it immensely comforting. The second kind of people, again, if they truly receive this message, will find it challenging and unsettling, but in a good way. And I'm going to start by talking about that first group of people. These people are like the young man that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. People who are somehow on some level conscious of moral failings, people who feel burdened by their past, by something that they did or perhaps failed to do. These are the people who stand before the presence of God's limitless love and mercy, and they say, I can't receive it. I'm not deserving enough. There's too much mess in my past, too much brokenness, too much dysfunction, too much chaos. I just cannot accept that kind of love for myself. And this whole idea of a limitless God, a limitless love pouring forth from God is wonderful, but it's not for the likes of me. To anyone who feels this way, I hope anyway that this message from the book of Hebrews is comforting, because it states that Jesus, the high priest of the new covenant, has dealt with all of your garbage, and it doesn't matter what it is, he's dealt with it. There's no stain in your being, however dark, that has not been purified by the shedding of his blood. There is nothing that you have said in the past or done in the past or thought in the past. There's nothing that you are saying now or doing now or thinking now that could possibly alienate you forever from God. Why? Because of Christ and his sacrifice. All of that stuff, that garbage, that darkness that you carry in your life has been nailed to the cross with him. So when God the Father looks on you, he doesn't see liar, coward, pervert, failure, junkie, or whatever the voice in your head says that you are. He looks at you and he sees his beloved child. He sees his precious son. He sees a cherished daughter. And as a child of the Father, you can enter into that loving presence whenever you wish through Christ. You don't have to make an appointment. You don't have to go through any kind of elaborate ritual. Anytime you want, you can embrace that love. As I said to that young man at camp again, or as I said to the kids at camp in general, just say yes to that love. You are being invited into infinite goodness. Say yes. There's nothing stopping you from receiving it. And now I can qualify that by saying, because of what Christ has done. Now, for some, this message might be challenging rather than comforting. Because I think we live in a culture now where we have been taught to believe that any guilt that you feel, any sense of shame that you feel is pathological, it's sick. As a matter of fact, I have colleagues who've told me I refuse to use the word sin in my sermons for that reason. And if we ever feel a sense of moral responsibility, in our culture anyway, if we ever experience a pang of conscience, we're taught immediately to repress it. And in the past, I've worked with parents who've literally verbally abused and neglected their children, and yet seem to possess no sense that they've done any wrong whatsoever. And if there was any blame to be laid, this is the impression I get when I'm talking to them, if there's any blame to be laid, it was on their parents, or on their ex-partner, or on the court system. Certainly not them. There's no sense of, I did something wrong here, and I need to wrestle with this. They were not conscious of any kind of moral defilement. I think to people like them, this message from the book of Hebrews ought to be somewhat challenging. So yes, of course we can enter into the presence of God's infinite love. We all can. But it's not because we're worthy. It's not because we've earned a place before God. It's not because we possess any moral purity that's of our own making, that comes from within us. It's because Jesus, our high priest, has dealt with our colossal mess, whatever that happens to be. And at a great price, I might add, at a great price. I think this passage from the book of Hebrews encourages us to look upon the cure of our sin, which is the eternal word of God himself, racked with pain on the cross, dying, bleeding and suffocating to death. It invites us to look upon that cure for our sin and ponder to ourselves, if God had to do this to save me, imagine how far gone I was. Again, there are two types of people I think who are going to hear this message. I actually think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because some days I think I fall into category 1, and I need to hear that whatever mess I've made of things, Jesus has dealt with it, and I'm loved. And some days I get cocky, I get self-righteous, I think that I'm better than I actually am, and I fall into the category number 2. And I think if you're anything like me, you're probably, you have a foot in both camps. And I need to be reminded sometimes, I don't have my act together. That I'm actually no better than the people that I meet in my ministry through pennies and sparrows, the people who are the most broken and lost in this community. I'm in just as much in need of a Savior as they are. But whoever we happen to be, maybe self-righteous Pharisee on Monday or broken and guilty tax collector on Friday, we stand before the presence of infinite holiness, infinite goodness, infinite love. We stand there not because we're worthy. We stand there not because some earthly priest has shed the blood of bulls or goats or lambs or whatever to cleanse our guilty conscience. We stand before a God of infinite love because Christ, our great high priest, offered himself once and for all. He is the guarantor of that better covenant. He has ushered us into the presence of infinite love, and in that love we stand eternally.